Hello and welcome to our online edition of our book study that's dealing with the class meeting. We're glad to have you here as we discuss today chapters 5 and 6 of Kevin Watson's books and talk about some of the things that ways in which he moves this conversation forward to talk about what it means to host a class meeting, what it means to define it, and what it means to live into how this historical type of meeting has been important for United Methodism. As we begin our discussion concerning these chapters, one of the first things to highlight is the fact that there's a need, as Kevin Watson points out, there's a need to set expectations for what it is that the class meeting is going to do, what it's going to accomplish, and what it's going to entail. He says on page 84, for those who are starting class meetings, you have to be ready to explain the basics of that meeting and the need of it to somebody who knows nothing about it and has no perspective of having been a part of this. That will be the case for the majority of the people to whom we give this as an option. And so we need to learn how and to think about what it means to explain that setup for people, what it is that we hope to glean out of such a meeting, and also what it means to encourage them to want to participate in such a meeting. And with that, he goes on to talk a bit about how this has been successful in other churches. He uses a couple of case studies, especially one out of Florida where he talks about how it reinvigorated the church. I want to remind you that we're not so much looking at this as a way of growing the church. It is not the necessarily end game that's happening here, but what we are talking about is strengthening nodes of our congregation that can help facilitate a greater strength and a greater structural viability for our church, so that we have those people and groups of people who are really exploring their spiritual life. And indeed, what Wesley had hoped that the Methodists would do was to talk about growth in terms of their own spiritual strength and their holiness. And so that's the way that we're really focusing on the use of this setup, the class meeting, and also the use of this material that Kevin Watson's sharing with us. Gerald, I think you want to talk about some of the basics.
Right. So as we move into chapter 5, it's entitled The Basics, and it's going to take us a little bit deeper into what it means to lead a class meeting. But let me just throw this idea out to you as we move into this part of it. And it's simply to say to you, strive to live free of comparisons. One of the things that is true about all of us is we've grown up in a culture which has taught us basically how to gauge where we are in all areas of life by comparing ourselves to each other's. That will not work with respect to a class meeting and with many areas of life. We have to begin to understand how to focus ourselves on our relationships with Christ. And each one of us is going to be at a different stage and different level. And a big dynamic of a class meeting has to be that wherever we are, we got to be okay with others if they're in a different place. So this is not about trying to get everybody on the same level or at the same place in their spiritual growth. If we try to do that, then we're going to struggle with building trust in the class meeting. And so we are after, we kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, we are after some positive provocation. Don't shy away from constructive confrontation. That's got to be a part of our class meetings. I'm going to talk a little bit later in the sermon about how to live free of comparisons, but it's important that when we begin to live free of comparisons, that doesn't mean we stop paying attention to the people around us. Class meeting is specifically about paying attention to each other, watching over one another in love. But we need to do that carefully, where we both build trust at the same time. We push and we don't shy away from doing things and saying things that require that we go deeper in what we've experienced and how we're dealing with the challenges of temptation and other things in our lives. So confrontation, when done well, is positive provocation to pursue personal participation in spiritual growth. I'll give you that for no charge, extra. Watson writes, it can be intimidating to try to say something at all about their relationship with God. People should be encouraged that answering the question becomes more natural in time. And more important, that people will find that they begin to interpret their lives through the lens of faith, and as a result, find that they are experiencing God in newer and deeper ways than they ever have before. So just a word of encouragement here that this will take a little bit of time. Give yourself time and give the people in the group time. Don't be impatient, and don't assume that because there's some who struggle with speaking or don't want to chime in that the whole thing is failing, because it just takes time, and we have to give each other some time. So make sure you are patient with this, but also don't shy away from positive provocation, and walk a line whereby people are empowered to participate, but don't move into conflict. And so chapter 5 takes us sort of to the life cycle of a group, which helps us kind of evaluate what's happening pretty much in the life of every group that we're a part of. The first part of the life cycle is birth. Group highly dependent upon the leader as they deal with the awkwardness of being in this kind of a group. You hear that, right, class leaders? That means that any one of us who's leading a class meeting has to be willing to step out, to go out and do and lead, and a lot of times that means telling your story, being vulnerable yourself, being willing to go out there, and again, depending on where you are in this whole spectrum, that might be uncomfortable for you. But it's going to be uncomfortable for everybody. And so as leaders, we can't wait around for somebody to speak up, especially early on in the group. We have to be willing to interject our life story and, lead. If you lead, then that'll encourage other people to do the same, people in the group to do the same. So there's the birth stage, and then there's establishing a routine. And this is where early on in the class meeting, you'll be talking a lot about, things that sound a lot like information, sharing information. But we're moving towards the transformation question. And so as the group continues to move along, we want to spend more time, and that ought to be our goal, to spend more time as the group grows to dealing with the transformation question. You remember the transformation question is, how is it with your soul? What ways have you seen God work, and what specific areas in your life do you need to focus on? We're really after the practical level of dealing with what's going on in our lives, and not just talking in generalities and sharing information. So there's birth, establishing a routine, and then the third is the questioning and refining the purpose of the group. That's the moment where the group sits around and people begin to think, is this all we're going to do? You got to be ready. You got to be ready for that. When you begin asking that question of yourself, or others in the group begin asking, it doesn't mean the group is failing. It just means that every group goes through a stage where the expectations that we were talking about earlier, they're going to need to change. And when they begin to change, there's going to be some time where you're wondering, okay, so what do we do with this, and where do we go with this? It's important that as you begin to work together as a group, you realize that that's natural, and that this is your opportunity to together figure out where you go with this and find out what it means to you as a group. And it doesn't have to be a negative experience. And I encourage you, if you know it's coming, be ready for it, and just appreciate the fact that people are thinking more deeply about what they're a part of. That's always a good thing, even if it feels kind of awkward or it's a struggle for a while.
If I can add one there, in chapter 4, I believe it was, he used the illustration of somebody that is wanting to do a marathon. And they have a goal of that, and they learn everything there is to know about shoes. They buy the shoes. They learn all about the techniques of running. But what they sometimes will fail to do is to run.
Yeah.
And so you're going to have that process. I know I've had that process happen in my mind and heart with a lot of hobbies. Amy can tell you I'm kind of bad at that. I'll know everything there is to know about something, and I won't do it. But you're going to have that process work through a lot of people, or with some people that are in a group, because they'll think of it short of the transformational question. They'll think of this is some tools I have or some things I can put in my knowledge box that will help me forward. But they're not really applying it to their lives. And so we have to do that, apply it to our lives, but also learn how to express and create the urge and the need for that transformation question to be asked in lives of others too. And that's the point at which the rubber meets the road, is in that redefining or refining purpose.
And so it's a good thing. It is what happens when you're willing to take the step from sort of the theoretical to the practical. And what happens in this thing that might not feel so good is that the group is taking ownership of what's happening in the group dynamic. So instead of it being something that Kevin Watson has written about in a book, it becomes something that we own as we experience it in life. And that's a good thing, a powerful thing for every group. And then the final cycle of a group is that maturity stage: adapt and change based on group needs or die. So no group is going to look exactly like any other group. We want to keep these basic goals in mind. We're after life transformation, but the dynamic of every group is going to be a little bit different, so don't be afraid of that. Notice that when your group matures, there are going to be certain distinctives that are part of the class leader's personality and a part of the personalities of each person in the group. And that's okay. You might talk with one another about how your group goes or something, and some things might come up, and that sounds very different from what you're experiencing in your group. That's all right. We are all different, and we are called upon to grow spiritually and recognize that doesn't mean we stop being unique individuals. It just means that however uniquely we are as individuals, we must be real about the struggles that are part of the Christian life and the reality of what it means to follow Christ in the midst of temptation and pressure and stress and all those kinds of things that are part of life. And so that's where the group begins to mature around things that are now being dealt with in the reality of our specific circumstances instead of just talking about them in generalizations. So finally, for this part in chapter 5, Watson writes, the most important ingredient to a successful group is you. Honesty with your group is crucial to its success. I might put a little caveat in there that the most important ingredient is the Holy Spirit, but we'll give him a pass there. Given that the Holy Spirit is going to be a part of our groups, I think what he's trying to say is, as a class leader, is truly essential to the group's success and survival, your attitude, what you bring, your willingness to be vulnerable, your willingness not just to talk about this, but to live it out in the presence of the group.
Yeah, thanks. Which moves us into the consideration of the role of the class leader, which is what he focuses on in chapter 6. I have used the statement before in a prior video presentation to talk about how we enter into this as co-equals. And we enter into as fellow journeymen with others who are in the discipleship process, and I think that's true. But we're one of the people who are doing it. But it also, Watson kind of chastised me a little bit in chapter 6 to be reminded of the importance of the role of a leader for those groups, and how central they can be of helping direct a class meeting, and how central they can be to the overall health, really, of the class meeting. One of the things that he says in page 102, and Gerald's used this word before already today, is that the people who serve as class leaders have to be able to be vulnerable and to share about their relationships with God. Now, we spent some time last week talking about that and have been trying to highlight this all the way through. It's not only someone has to be contemplative about their own experience, have a story to tell, and also to be able to articulate that story, but to open themselves up to talking about both the successes of it and the limitations of it, or the trials of it, what that means. And so vulnerable is a good word that brings us into that fold, but also gives us a kind of a perspective about how we model class meetings really within the leader. That you're talking about the transformational question, you do that internally, but you also are able to do that externally with class members. Let me share just a brief illustration of this that has nothing to do with a class meeting, but was a really instructive point in my my young life. I've never dealt with being a shepherd, but I have herded a few cows before. And I was sent by my father one time to go get our beef cows out of to bring them up toward the barn. And so I went over to where they were, some several hundred yards from the barn, and got behind them and started throwing my hands up and shooing them and everything else. And they would run off here and run off there, threw rocks at them and everything else, trying to get them to head toward the barn. And I was kind of running around like a chicken with my head cut off behind them, trying to get them to go. And they would not follow me for anything. And finally I gave up. And so I just started back to the house, sort of dejected, and went up the path that the cows always used. And I noticed as I got about halfway to the barn, I looked up, and there was one cow who had started following me. And then I looked again, and here comes the rest of the cows, and they weren't responding to the fact of getting stuff thrown at them, but they were responding to the fact of, actually it wasn't me, it was the cow that lead female cow that was in front, and they were following her. Mm-hmm. And it taught me a great lesson about sometimes leadership is not so much about corralling folks as it is about simply sort of showing what your journey is, or what this cow showed me was, she says, look, come on, we're going to do this, not because y'all need to go, but she says, I'm going, come along with me. And that was a silly illustration, but I think a true illustration about how the class meeting can work in its best capacity. It's inviting people to join you in the journey of Christian discipleship that you've experienced in your own life.
Yeah.
And that becomes a way of truth leading from the front. It is, because you're saying, I've been on this journry. Anyway, I think that's a great way to talk about the role of the class leader. Mm-hmm. Watson does go on to point out that was very pivotal, and I don't know that this was part of the plan of class meeting, but it was very pivotal to have these people seen as shepherds, or the word he uses, spiritual leaders of the class meeting, because they rolled into that role, or they fell into that role, and it became noticeable from other people, from Wesley and then others throughout the history of this movement, of the centrality of those people to the process. It sort of couldn't be done haphazardly, and I want to reiterate this, that it could not be done from pastor to laity. It was not something that happened across that divide near as easily, seamlessly, and purposefully as it did when laity were doing that. So people among them.
Mm-hmm. I know it's easy for us to think in terms of, well, you're a grown person, you ought to be able to figure it out yourself. And sometimes, though, the struggle, whether it be cows or sheep or people, is the environment that we've grown up in conditions us certain ways, and we kind of need some help, some leadership out of that. Watson makes the point that I just want to highlight. There is a strong desire in contemporary Methodism to avoid being judgmental or condemning, and we kind of all have grown up with that, which has resulted in a near total abandonment of any real standards or expectations for membership. And so when you leave people to their own devices, that's where they live. It's like, okay, I do whatever I want to do. And that's why so much of a lack of spiritual growth happens, I think, many times, is because, for most of us, if we don't have any leadership or guidance out of where we are, we just stay right where we are because it's pretty comfortable. And that's the challenge of us, and why we think the class meeting is such an effective vehicle for helping us.
Yeah. One of the illustrations out of the early class meetings in England that took place was an idiom, a sort of catchphrase that came out of early Methodist class meetings. And John Wesley was formative in this. And this was this statement: earn all you can, save all you can, give all you can. All right. That has nothing to do with your spiritual life in one sense. But what it did say was, this is the effect of one's spiritual life in all other parts of the community and all other parts of life in general. And that was one of the things that had to be discussed. It had to be modeled. It had to be talked about in those class meetings to say, this is what I do now, indeed how I look at my life every day is through the lens of my Christian experience.
Right.
And that's what you're saying. But it's not only just the stuff one does on a Sunday. It's not just one stuff does at a particular time while worship is going on. It happens, Christianity happens as life happens. And that becomes then, all of that becomes an atmosphere to look at through the lens of faith and to talk about in the class meeting. And as you said, we haven't taken advantage of that near as much as we have to do. But discipleship has to do with life. It's not just about how we do church.
That's right. And a lot of that discipleship happens outside of church. It can't be like, okay, I'm at church and I'm doing discipleship, and then when I leave church, that stops. That approach causes a whole lot of folks to struggle mightily with temptation and all kinds of issues in life that a lot of people are struggling with today.
Yeah. We're going to be talking a little bit about that. I think Wednesday night when we do the next Zoom meeting, we're going to talk about where the context is that you would hold or host a class meeting. And Watson talks a bit about how Sunday school is important. And he saw, this is chapter 4 too, he saw as Sunday school rose in popularity, so went down the popularity or use of the class meetings because we formalized it in some ways, and then it turned into information meetings and the like. Again, great ideas to do, but it sort of took that over. So we want to be talking about and exploring some places and some spaces and some different settings in which we can do these class meetings. Zoom may be perhaps being one of them, but other places other than the times that are set aside or that we have used for these types of things are just transitioning how we look at, maybe even how we look at those times, or what's part of those Sunday school times, or Wednesday night Bible study, those kinds of things. There's room for this sort of setup within the context of our church.
So we've talked about the class leader, being patient, being vulnerable, being a positive provocateur. Let me just close by sharing with you a couple of things that a class leader is not. Remember, a class leader is not a teacher. That doesn't mean that those who will be class leaders are not teachers in other settings, in other situations, but this might be the greatest challenge for some of us because we're so used to teaching when we get into a group. Class leader is not a teacher. Second, in order to resist the temptation to become the expert of the group, the class leader should not feel the need to respond to every person at every meeting. We're not there to have an answer for everything. A lot of times, a person voicing their struggle is the good answer for this moment. Just to move from keeping stuff internalized to being willing to voice it, that's an amazing thing. And those of us who've gone through that experience, we know, that there's some answers are found just when you do that. So don't feel a need to fix every problem or solve every issue. Again, that's not exactly what we're after here. We're after answers to these things, but a lot of times the benefit is when a person figures some things out for themselves in a context of safety, when they're surrounded by other people who are wrestling with similar things and trying to figure out answers for themselves. And then third, the class leader should not allow the weekly meeting to last more than an hour and a half. For some of us, that'll be more challenging than others, but it's important because you don't want people dreading coming to class meetings because they're exhausted by the time the class meeting is concluded. Lord willing, we'll have another opportunity to meet again next week, so we don't have to solve every issue or talk through everything every week. And then finally, the class leader should not allow the group to grow beyond 12 members. Again, that's a thing that we have to be disciplined about and be focused on. There's a reason for that, because we all know when we think about it that when groups get too large, the larger the group gets, the smaller our willingness to participate and share things that are intimate to our lives and struggles. And so it begins to then kind of defeat the purpose of a class meeting. We'll have other classes and groups that we can let get big or whatever, but this is something we want to keep small.
Yeah, that's right. They do get unwieldy over 12 members, and that's a truth for a lot of different ones, just besides this. So be reading through chapters 5 and 6 this week. There's a lot of good information there that we've not covered today. He's done a great job of talking about the positives of the class meeting, defining it, and also the role of the leaders. And he's also talked a great deal about some of the limitations you're going to run up against. One of the better conversations in all of that I read this past week was about the life cycle of the church, particularly, life cycle of the class meeting. And I thought that was particularly helpful because these are just sort of viewpoints from the battlefront about how this stuff's worked out, and he's very helpful in that. And I think that will let you see some of the potential things that can happen there and recognize them as they do take place.
That's right.
So thank you all for being a part of this presentation today. We anticipate that we will have one more presentation next week. We will have a Zoom meeting next Wednesday night, and we would like to invite you to be a part of that. If you've been watching these and have not asked to be a part of the Zoom meeting yet, we please ask you to send us an email to let us know, or a phone call to let us know that you would like to be invited into that Zoom meeting, and we will gladly forward you an invitation to that next week on our list. Thank you all for coming today.
Thank you.
I look forward to talking to you soon.